They called him a giant and named his people monsters, but we call him an ancestor. From Magellan's frozen mutiny to Drake's ghostly shore, Europe carved myths from our bones and called them history. Tonight, we break that spell. This is the truth behind the giant cannibals of Patagonia, told not from their empire's ink, but from our fire. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. They say he danced on the beach, a man so large the sailors could stare straight into his navel as if it were an eclipse. He sang. He dusted his hair. He raised his arms to the sky in salute to a god whose name the Europeans would not learn and therefore would rename. On that cold Patagonian strand, far from Seville's bell towers and Lisbon's blue-tiled courtyards, men who had survived 2 oceans, a mutiny, and their own hunger felt their throats turn to chalk. Later, they would call him a giant and make his neighbors into monsters. They would lace fear to rumor and rumor to law. But we who inherit that coast and its stubborn wind, we who still carry the cheekbones of those families who hunted the steppe, have another word for him. We call him an ancestor. We call him a man, the kind who greets strangers by singing toward the horizon, the kind whose shadow falls longer because the sun is low, not because the heart beneath that shadow is less human than yours. Listen, the tide is coming in. A story is approaching with it, the kind that keeps you awake after the fire burns down. Begin at the end of the world and the start of a rumor. September 1522. Juan Sebastian Elcano limps into Sanlúcar de Barrameda with a single ship, the Victoria, all ribs and canvas and stubbornness. 18 men lean on her rails like ghosts who forgot to lie down. Of the 270 who sailed under Magellan, only that narrow handful returns. Their first circumnavigation is written not in laurels, but in gums swollen by scurvy, in storms that blind with St. Elmo's fire, in the taste of rat meat seared on a piece of iron. Among the marvels, their gentleman chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, carries home is a notebook that smells of salt and smoke. In it, he swears before God and grammar that he stood face to belly with a people in the South who were taller than sailors dared to be, who painted their faces like spirits and ate meat raw, who called upon a deity named Setebos, and who, when tricked, roared with the voice of bulls. That notebook would cast a shadow as long as our continent. Giants, it whispers, and then it begins to shout. How a word learned to chain people's Spain in those bright and brutal years hungered for more than spices and souls. It starved for stories that made its maps look inevitable. In that narrow space where scripture met greed, a word was minted like a coin. Cannibal. The syllables came tangled. Carib, Canaba, Khan, misheard on a beach and set in type by men who never smelled mangrove or guava. Out of the confusion rose a category that warmed the hands of conquistadors and cooled the consciences of confessors. If a people could be named cannibal, they could be conquered under the banner of just war. They could be chained, their bodies could be priced. Even when a pope spoke with thunder and declared that the peoples of these lands were truly men, rational and free, mercy arrived freighted with loopholes, and the ink of bulls ran in the same channels as the silver from Potosi. What we said in those courts was small and soft. What Europe called us was loud enough to echo across oceans. A word did not merely describe, it devoured. Pigafetta's pages begin far north of the giant's cold country. He writes of Brazil as the land of Verzin, pau-Brasil, the red resin wood that stained Europe's fingers like a guilty blush. He sets down the comic tenderness of first contact, our people trading baskets of fruit for mirrors and bells, laughing to see the ship's boats hoisted at dawn as if the great vessel were nursing its own children. Then the pen pricks deeper. He notes that enemies are sometimes eaten, ritual, not feast, custom, not hunger. Others would later describe it at closer range. Hans Staden, a German captive, and Jean de Léry, a French Huguenot who found in the Tupi world a mirror in which to judge Europe. In their telling, you hear the rhythm of vengeance and song, carefully staged, not a carnival of mindless appetite. Yet what Antwerp and Frankfurt loved best were not the paragraphs, but the pictures. Theodor de Bry's engravings, limbs arranged like theater, fanned by a Europe eager to crown itself civilized by painting us as the inverse. Ritual became spectacle, spectacle became permission, permission became a chain, a river with memory and a coast with teeth south, where the sea turns green and the sky sits close to the skull, rumor gathered muscle. Pigafetta tells of a river mouth where Solus died, of a man coming aboard with a voice like a bull, of a stride so long sailors could not keep pace. 4 years before, Juan Díaz de Solís had fallen on that coast, killed most likely by Charrua or Guarani defenders who decided a steel-clad trespass was still a trespass. Fear rewrites quickly. When a captain dies, a stew pot appears in the story as if conjured by grief. What remains certain is this. A leader died, his men scattered, and rivers learned new names while canoes slid along their banks as they always had. Cannibal, giant, heathen, nets thrown over water that did not consent to be tamed. When Magellan moored in the bay, he named San Julian. His officers already held knives to their throats. The land looked barren. The strait, if it existed, felt like a mirage behind glass. A Portuguese commander gave orders to Spanish captains, and the belly complains louder under discipline. The mutiny broke quietly, like a plate wrapped in cloth, and ended in noise. Luis de Mendoza, captain of the Victoria, was stabbed on his own deck and quartered like a warning, nailed to the wind. Gaspar de Quesada followed, head taken clean, dignity not. Juan de Cartagena, too connected to kill, was condemned to a softer death that felt harder, marooned with a priest on that icy shore, the horizon their only congregation. This is the season when giants enter the ledger. Blood smokes the snow. The commander has proven he can bend men to his will. The bay grows still as a cathedral after the last candle guttered out. In the quiet, footsteps approach. "Here be giants," writes the gentleman with frozen ink. The beach answers with a dancer, a broad face painted red, yellow circles around the eyes, hearts on the cheeks as if to remind the world that even warriors carry tenderness somewhere. A heavy bow, a thick string, and shoes of leather cut from guanaco hides. The envoy, a brave man or a very foolish one, mimics the dance, and the stranger laughs the way men do when children attempt the steps of elders. He leads him to the island where the flagship lies, and more men follow, bodies wrapped in sewn skins, women sturdy and unafraid. They hunt with craft, tie a calf to a bush, and wait for the mother's love to be her undoing. They eat much, raw, because winter teaches what firewood weighs. They paint their faces like the spirits they know. They call on Setebos, a power of air and underworld. Our word crossed later into London and became theater, proof that Europe could borrow a god faster than it could learn to pronounce a prayer. The meeting holds, and for a moment, the cold forgets its job. What happened next is the kind of wound that does not scar. It stays open and educates. Magellan, who had mastered Spaniards with daggers and fear, attempted to master Patagonians with gifts and a lie. He sent mirrors, beads, knives, bells. He watched the delight gather. When two younger men's hands were too full, he offered one last present, iron rings, joined by a short chain, a way to carry treasure on the ankles. The hammer sang, the bolt bit, realization bloomed like fire, too late. The chained men roared and called on Setebos, but the prayer met iron, and iron does not reason. Their unshackled companions were seized by the wrists and marched to the mainland to fetch a wife left behind, as if the kidnapping could be wrapped as mercy. Someone slipped a knot. Arrows flew in the scrub. A sailor died with a thigh pierced clean through. Crossbows and arquebuses, too heavy for the dance of that skirmish, fell behind bodies that moved with the country's own wind. A village burned. Women disappeared into the brush, alive and furious. Pigafetta, for once plain, writes the truth we remember. Men fought to protect their women. The fleet remembered biscuits vanishing in a single swallow and rats being eaten without being skinned. We recognize the chain. From that winter and that chain, a name spread across Europe like frost, Patagón. Pigafetta notes it, the captain named this kind of people Patagón, as if naming were not already the first theft. Later, tidy minds would insist the word came from pata, foot, and that our people were merely big-footed myths on a map. But scholars have hunted the word through the brambles of Renaissance print and found a monster named Patagón stalking a romance called Primaleón, printed years before Magellan sailed. A man of that age could lift characters out of a book and lay them over a coastline like a tracing paper of fear. Europe often saw us that way, not face to face, but page to page, fiction pressed onto skin. The name stuck, as names given in the wrong language sometimes do, and our actual words were tucked into the earth to survive. Were they giants? This is where the bone speaks and the wind nods. Travelers later, Darwin's captains, wandering Englishmen, Argentine chroniclers, found Tehuelche and Aónikenk people tall by European measure, long-limbed as if the steppe had stretched them. The archaeologists who came with rulers, formulas, and respect found average male statures that would have surprised a 16th century sailor used to shorter companions. Some men were very tall indeed. None was 10 feet. Leather footwear splayed in mud, leaving generous prints that made fright easy to believe. A long stride looks like sorcery if you have been shivering for months. Against the enamel of printers' fantasies, we hold human enamel, teeth worn by meat and cold, knees made wide by a lifetime of running after herds. Tall, yes. Myth, no. The truth stands upright and does not need stilts. An English winter found its way to the same bay decades later. June 1578. Sir Francis Drake arrived with ships tired of their own creaking and a secret commission to hurt Spain wherever the currents would grant him the courtesy. He did as Magellan had done, made camp with the cold, judged a man, and raised an axe. Thomas Doughty, friend and rival, died on that stone beach, and the wind added his name to those already whispered there. Drake met our people, traded gifts, and turned archery into a friendly contest until a bowstring snapped in an English hand, and panic misted the air. Arrows flew as if grown from soil. One sailor, Oliver, took a shaft through the heart, clean as a clock striking. Mr. Robert Winter was hit in the lung. Drake, gunpowder damp, lifted an arquebus and shot hail into the belly of the man who had pierced Winter. The wounded hunter roared like 10 bulls joined together, and his companion vanished into the trees because living is a better honor than dying theatrically. Drake buried his dead and did something Magellan's circle had not. He cooled the fever of marvel. Tall, he wrote, savage in defense, voices like gravel, but not monsters. If there was monstrousness, he suggested, Spain had taught it. Across the water, an ink-faced poet listened to sailors in taverns and found a god tucked into their talk. Shakespeare gave to Caliban, a colonized man drawn in English chalk, the god Setebos. Our spirit became a line in an English play, reduced and reframed, proof that Europe could turn our sacred into scenery faster than it could pronounce the names of our dead. Patagonia kept its borrowed echo. Caliban kept the breath of cannibal in its syllables, and schoolboys would speak both without ever lifting their eyes toward the south. This is how theft behaves when it wears a velvet glove. It borrows with charm, misnames with confidence, and expects gratitude for the attention. Our answer is older than their stage. We keep singing the original name to the original wind until the copy fades. And now, the other half of the rumor. The English and the Spanish dragged accusations like nets across every coast they saw. Among Patagonian peoples, Aónikenk, Tehuelche, Puelche, the charge of man-eating falls apart under the weight of evidence. Hunters of guanaco and rias, gatherers of roots and herbs, burying their dead with rites that face the wind. None of that fits the pamphlets. Those demons belching fire in Pigafetta's lines are less ethnography than translation errors dressed for church, masks, and dances forced into the vocabulary of hell. Elsewhere, the term cannibal did precise work. In the Caribbean, Carib braided to cannibal in decrees so that bodies could be seized in holy order. In Brazil, Hans Staden's captivity tale and Jean de Léry's keen eye showed ritual anthropophagy in war, terrifying to readers, yes, but bound by rule and song, while European presses preferred to run woodcuts that sharpened fear and sold more books. A label in Europe could become a license in America. Say cannibal, and the chain appears, clean as a halo hammered from iron. What we accept and what we refuse. Do I deny that men ate men in our hemisphere? I deny nothing that memory and honest witness affirm. In some forests, on some beaches, the flesh of enemies taken in war was made sacred by ritual, and the bones told stories to the living. In other places, the charge rises from smoke, fear, vengeance, greed. I say the Patagonian giants were giants mostly in the eyes of sailors, starving for wonder and frightened by a long stride in a long land. I say Patagón was a romance character stitched onto our steppe like a borrowed pelt. I say cannibal became a lever to pry open bodies and take them. I say our Brazilian cousins once sang over captives because their cosmos contained duties ours no longer does. At the same time, Europeans who could not read the grammar of those rites preferred to pronounce judgment rather than learn vocabulary. Consider the measurements that matter. In San Julián, European irons fit Patagonian ankles. European clothes fit Patagonian shoulders. A captive learned enough words, bread, water, to joke and argue. A husband mourned a wife with the same helplessness that sailors felt for women waiting in Triana. Read around Pigafetta's adjectives, and you find a winter camp where fear and respect circled each other like wolves. Years later, when English sailors trudged the same stones, they found a gallows circled by bones and decided, wrongly, that Cartagena had swung there after all. Rumor had rehearsed so many times it felt like memory. Drake killed his friend, judged our people less than monstrous, and sailed west. The giants shrank to tall men in one journal, and then took steroid doses in French engravings for another century. Only when archaeology learned to ask bones to speak gently did the roar of 10-foot talk quiet down. Honest measurements placed our Aónikenk men at heights that would make a Cadiz sailor blink, yes, but not inhuman, only impressive, as the land had a right to make them. And Setebos, ferried to the globe, kept whispering our old syllables in a theater that thought it had renamed them forever. So, did Spanish explorers meet giant cannibals? From the Latin side of the fire, under a sky broad enough for pride and remorse, I answer this way. They met us, sometimes taller, sometimes singing over the bodies of enemies because war and faith demanded it, sometimes bringing fruit and building a house and calling down rain, sometimes hiding our women and bending our bows, as any man will who loves someone, always refusing to be small. The Victoria fades into marshlight at San Lucar. Magellan's bones sleep somewhere salt cannot name. Still, our story walks the San Julian shore and leaves prints the size of mythology. When a traveler comes, with a book in his pack and a rumor in his mouth, we invite him to place his boot in one of our footprints. Decide for yourself if it belongs to a monster or a man. Either way, the wind will lift the dust from your hair, and the sky will be so bare it tells the truth. We were never giants, never monsters. We were and are a people who chose not to kneel. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.